Hey everyone, welcome to our first video where we're going to be looking at some grammatical highlights in the Greek text of the New Testament book of Philippians. Of course, the Apostle Paul is the author here, and he gets started with a pretty customary introduction and greeting in verses 1 and 2. And we're going to start by looking at some of the interesting words and interesting grammar. Some of it will be review for you. But we're going to start by looking at this in chapter 1, verse 3. And he begins by using the verb which means I thank God. Now this should be review, but when we see the word for God here with the article, in the dative case, we might be thinking, well, isn't this going to be like a prepositional idea? Why does it follow on the heels of the verb I thank? Well, the reason is because even though we learned in first year the accusative is the direct object, depending on the verb, sometimes the direct object can be in the dative case. And that's the case with the verb eucharisto. Here it's taking its direct object in the dative, and the translation would be, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. We're going to talk a little bit in this class about phonology, which is probably one of the lesser important disciplines in our study of New Testament Greek, but still it's helpful to be aware of it. And in verse 4, I think we have an example, a possible example of the importance of phonology. I'm going to say it in Greek, and maybe you can notice some of the sounds that emerge. We have pantote en pase desi mu huper panton humon. And I'll stop right there. Maybe you heard and saw we've got a pi right there. Pantote en pasi desi mu huper, another pi there, panton humon. And what is he saying here? He says, always in every one of my requests for all of you. And so it kind of has this machine gun effect, and maybe complements this idea that he's always praying for them. Okay, this would be a possible demonstration of the importance of phonology. Down here in verse 6, also by way of review, he says, having become confident, or being confident of, he says, auto tuto. So we've got two pronouns here, right? This is the personal pronoun autos, which sometimes functions as a personal pronoun. A lot of times it functions as an adjective. It could be identifying a noun or pronoun. It could be emphasizing the noun or the pronoun. And then here we've got the demonstrative pronoun this. So the idea is having been persuaded of this very thing. Here we've got, it's in the adjectival position, autos is, auto, and it's emphasizing tuto, so we would translate it this very thing. In verse 7, we're going to see diata with the accusative here, even as it is just for me to think this of all of you. And then he says diata with the infinitive. Now, I don't know about you, but it took me a while in my journey in studying New Testament Greek to remember that infinitive will sometimes occur with certain prepositions, and their translation is a little closer to an indicative verb. So he says, because, not to have, but because I hold you in the heart, which would be in my heart. This expression is a little difficult right here. First of all, because sometimes we forget that the infinitives can appear with a preposition and be translated more as an indicative. But the other reason is because the infinitive will take its subject in the accusative, and that's a little different. We just have to get used to seeing that in Greek. And so he's talking about what he does with them. We might say, well, if me, which is translated I or me, is in the accusative, and humas, which means you all, is in the accusative, how do we know which one is the subject of ekin? And the answer would be the context, but also how close me is to the infinitive. And so here the Apostle Paul is saying, because I hold you in the heart. Or in other words, I hold you in my heart. In English, we tend to use the personal pronoun, my or your or their, with body parts. In this case, it's heart, which is symbolic for his affections, his affection. But in Greek, often they appear grammatically impersonal, but the context will usually be quite clear as to whose heart he's talking about. The two words that the Apostle Paul uses here are interesting, apologia. When we think of an apologist, we think of someone who explains and defends the gospel. And that word in English has preserved the sense of the Greek word. And then the confirmation here In just a few minutes, he's going to talk about how he has some religious enemies who preach the gospel, but they do it with wrong motives and with wrong attitudes. But the Philippians can identify with the Apostle Paul in the sense that they have the same motives and the same attitudes. And this is what strengthens these aspects of Paul's ministry, is knowing these Philippians are with him. There's another two very important words that appear in verse 9. He says, "In this I pray that your love, yet more and more, might abound in," and then here's the two words, "knowledge and all discernment." And so the love of God in the life of a believer is best expressed when it's abounding in knowledge and in discernment. We are ministering in the context of South America, where the charismatic church and Pentecostal churches have become very strong. And though I think you have to take each church on its own merits, a lot of the churches down here are very emotional and very shallow doctrinally. And people often get carried away with a lot of crazy ideas, and they end up feeling disillusioned with their whole religious experience. Oh, that's not evidence that they were disillusioned by the gospel. That's evidence that they have believed a false gospel. The true gospel is one in which our love is abounding in these two virtues, in knowledge and discernment. In verse 11, we see a participle that's in the perfect tense, and it's worth considering whether or not the Apostle Paul wrote this thinking of something that's happening presently to believers or something that will be shown to be true sometime in the future. Because if we go up to verse 10, in order that you might prove things that are excellent, in order that you might be sincere and blameless in the day of Christ, having been filled with the fruit of righteousness which is through Jesus Christ. So having been filled, the question would be, is this something that we're presently being filled with, or is this something that will be manifest in the day of Christ? And although I wouldn't be dogmatic about either of the two options, I do think that because it follows the heels of the day of Christ, this is something that will become manifest in the future. Verse 12 begins with an infinitive from ginosko, which means to know. And if we go a little bit further down the verse, we see, okay, it's a complementary infinitive. There we have boulomai, which is I want. And so we begin verse 12 with, but I want you to know, brothers. You might notice that verse 13 begins with hoste. This is a little word that indicates purpose, and the infinitive will often follow it. We don't see an infinitive until quite a bit later, but there it is. Geneste goes with hoste. And he says, so that my bonds or my chains manifesting Christ are, or have become, we might say. And oftentimes in our translations, we have to transform the infinitive into more of an indicative or subjunctive idea, especially if it's warranted by the key word which indicates purpose or result. So that my bonds are or have become manifest. Down here in verse 15, he's going to talk about some people who opposed his mission. And he says, some indeed through phanon and erin. Now, as often happens, the more we read the New Testament, the more familiar we'll become with it, the easier it will even seem. But there will still be words that aren't all that common, and we'll want to look them up. And so I have a tab open here where I've done a word search for phanon, because for me it's one of those words that's not so common. And traditionally, beginning in verse 15 in the different commentaries, there's not been complete agreement over who these people are. We don't know if these are pagan opponents of the Apostle Paul, if these are religious opponents, if these are Judaizers. It's not super clear. But one thing we can do is do a quick word search. And what I've done is I've typed in phanos to search the whole Greek New Testament. I'm using accordance with my PC. And you can see that it occurs, in 9 verses here in the New Testament. In Matthew 27 it occurs, it says they delivered him because of phanon. So the idea seems to be because of envy. They were jealous of Jesus' popularity, perhaps jealous of the power that he manifested. Here again in Mark 15, it's the same thing. They knew that for envy or jealousy, the high priest had delivered him over, handed him over. In Romans 1, the Apostle Paul uses it to describe one of the vices among the pagan nations, because Romans 1 deals more with pagan history, and Romans chapter 2 with religious Jewish history. We see it occur a few times throughout the writings of the Apostle Paul. And perhaps the most significant is in 1 Timothy 6:4. Here he's talking about some religious opponents, And we see him use the same combination of vices. We see the phthanos, and then we see the eris. And the context would be, he says, these are people who are debating about questions, and they're disputing about the meaning of different words, perhaps genealogies. And then it says, from whom come phthanos, eris, and blasphemies, and other vices. So if we go back to verse 15, phthanon pretty clearly is referring to envy and jealousy, and erin can be translated strife. The context of these two vices becomes clear as we continue through the verse. And he says, some through goodwill, ton Christon kerususin. And some through goodwill or from goodwill in their own hearts, they preach Christ. Just as the Lord Jesus had opponents who affirmed the Old Testament, but their spirit was completely wrong, even to the point where they rejected the messenger of the Old Testament, the messenger of the covenant, who is Jesus Christ, it appears that the Apostle Paul had some enemies who preached Christ, but they did it with the wrong attitudes and wrong motives. What Paul says beginning in verse 16 is very instructive. In verses 16 and 17, he starts by saying hoi. Hoi is the article, it's the Greek article, but it's functioning as a relative pronoun, like a pronoun marker, to refer to one of the two groups. And it becomes clear which group he's talking about when he says, the one group indeed out of love. Verse 17 is going to start with the hoi as well. And there's a few different possibilities for how we could translate it. I would probably opt for something like the former group or the latter group. So the latter group out of love, knowing that for the defense of the gospel, I am set. The former group out of selfish ambition preach Christ, not sincerely, supposing to raise up affliction to my chains. Apparently, the affliction that the Apostle Paul is talking about here is the fact that some of these people had the right message, but they had the wrong spirit. And that can be harmful in the presentation of the gospel. The people who identified with the Apostle Paul in their spirit and in their message are characterized by this love that he's talking about. They shared the gospel, and they helped defend the gospel in this love. And those who didn't probably saw Paul as a nuisance or maybe even an opponent. And knowing that kind of spirit was circulating with the spread of the gospel was not pleasant for Paul. That seems to be the idea of the affliction here that he could have experienced while he was imprisoned. But then he says in verse 18, what then? Plain might be translated nevertheless, or in any case, that in every way, whether as a pretext or whether in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice. Maybe some of you have seen, like I have seen, that God will often use churches that do not have good doctrine or do not have sound practices to reach people, and they'll get a grounding, a very loose grounding in the Scriptures. But the fact that the Scriptures are to some degree taught and practiced is enough to help the people get going in the right direction. A lot of times those people will end up in a stronger church and grow, and even to the point where they thank God that they were able to get out of that prior experience that they had had. But God can use the preaching of the gospel even when it's not done with the right spirit. We don't rejoice in those situations as such, but we do rejoice in the fact that God can use them to further the gospel. Down in verse 19, we're going to see the Apostle Paul use the term salvation in maybe a slightly less common way, but it's not all that uncommon in the New Testament. He says, for I know that this to me will turn, the idea is, will turn to my salvation. Of course, a lot of times this term refers to spiritual salvation, but here, as if we consider it in the broader context, he's talking about being freed from prison. He's talking about being liberated physically from prison, as these Philippians would make request and pray for him. Down here in verse 22, he talks about something I made reference to earlier. But to live in the flesh, or the idea might be, but if I live in the flesh. Again, we don't see the personal pronoun I in this phrase, but contextually it's kind of there in the background, if you will. And when we're translating it to English, we have to decide what's the best way to convey the sense. So if he says, but if I live in the flesh, this to me, literally, fruit of labor. This to me is the fruit of my labor or my work. Just as we saw with the participle above, having been filled with the fruit of righteousness, he's saying the opportunity to bear fruit will come to the extent that God gives me opportunity in this life to serve Him. And so this was the conflict that the Apostle Paul experienced, wanting to be with Christ, but knowing that the longer he lived, the more fruit that he could bear, which would result from his labor. So if we had to talk about it chronologically, God gives us life as we serve the Lord and we work for Him. That will result in fruit. We know that the genitive has a lot of possible uses, probably more than 20 different possibilities if we look at all the different nuances. But here the idea seems to be the fruit that results from work. If we move down to verse 25, and he says, and being persuaded or having been persuaded of this, I know that I will remain. We see that little circumflex over the omega, right? And so we've got the future tense there. I will remain. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is this? Is this a synonym? Is there a slight difference in the meaning of parameno? And why does he group them together like this? What's the significance? I will remain and remain with all of you for the progress and joy of faith, or your faith. This is another instance where it might be helpful to either do a word search like we did with phonon. The kind of search I did here, just searching for the word as it occurs in the New Testament. If you don't have a program like Accordance, you can order, I think through Amazon, an Englishman's Greek Concordance, which will do the same thing for you. Of course, a Bible program is a little faster and it gives you other capabilities which are very handy. But here what I've done is I've looked up in BDAG, parameno. And here it's defined as to remain in a state or situation, or to continue in an official capacity, continue in an occupation or office. So that's a pretty close meaning to the word meno itself, but maybe the reason he mentions both of these is this is the general idea of staying around, in other words, not being killed in prison. And this verb describes more the Apostle Paul's specific role and capacity to encourage these Philippian believers. So he's going to stick around for the specific purpose of the progress and joy of the faith of these Philippians. There's a special word that occurs here in verse 27, paletueste. This word only occurs, I think, in its verbal and noun form just a few times in the whole New Testament. He says, only worthy of the gospel of Christ, conduct yourselves, and the idea is conduct yourselves as citizens belonging to a specific kingdom or realm. So if I go to chapter 3, verse 20, we're going to see the noun form of that verb, and where he says, for our citizenship is in heaven, palituma. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, and anybody who identifies with Christ understands that we identify with something that's greater than just the things that can be seen and experienced in the here and now. We are citizens and representatives of the kingdom that is coming, that is not made with human hands. And this fact helps explain the word that he uses down here in 28 to describe how the world sees these citizens of the kingdom of heaven. He says, and in nothing being frightened or terrified, by those who oppose you, which is to them evidence of apoleas. So if these citizens of heaven are not afraid by what worldly citizens can do to them, in other words, kill them, crucify them, throw them to the wild beasts in the Colosseum, in some of the worst case scenarios, how is it that they can't be frightened? If they're not frightened, it must be apoleas. The sense is they're out of their minds. They threaten even to the point of condemning our way of life. And so oftentimes these people were despised and killed, and they were looked at as though they were crazy. But those who have believed the gospel, this is a sign of our salvation. And here he's talking about the spiritual sense of our salvation, even physical. Because even if a believer loses their life, they have the promise of the resurrection through the power of the risen Lord. And of course, this comes from God. We don't want to overlook what he says up here in verse 27. He says, with one psuche. So psuche can be translated heart or mind or soul. And sometimes we have to kind of give the sense Here he says, with one psuche, striving together. So, a word that might help us appreciate this Greek word is the word athlete. Soon, of course, doing it with someone or something, striving together in or for, because the dative isn't always super clear. We want to do our best to see from the context if we can clarify what English preposition might be best. But striving together in or for the faith of the gospel. We understand that this striving together, our sanctification as believers, it kind of holds some things in tension. For instance, we know that grace is given to us of God. It's free. It's not something we earned. But at the same time, once we've experienced grace and we're saved, we do have to strive. And we see these dos aspects here in the closing of chapter 1. We have the striving together in or for the faith of the gospel. And then the agona here carries the same sense. He says, you all have the same struggle. This is like an athletic struggle. This is a working towards a goal, and it's not easy. But having the same struggle, I memorized this as conflict, but conflict in English really doesn't capture the struggle concept that is tied in to what he says up here, sunathluntes, that the Apostle Paul has in mind. And he continues, which you saw in me, and now here in me, or here to be in me. So there's this definite active participation and struggling that is necessary for believers in order to live a life of faith and demonstrate, manifest that we are citizens of heaven, to defend the gospel and confirm the gospel with our life and with our spirit or our attitude. But I also want to end by simply emphasizing the role that God plays. We see this throughout the whole New Testament, that there are these mandates, there are these injunctions upon people to believe the gospel and live for God. But then it says that once we do this, once we understand this, this was something that was given to us or graced to us by God, and that eliminates all religious pride and boasting. So just a little review of first-year grammar. Here we see the verbal form of grace. Now we don't often in English say he or she graced something to you, but that was common in the first century. He says, because to you it was given or graced on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him. So this struggling that we do in and for the faith of the gospel is not going to be understood or appreciated by the world, and sometimes it might even end in the physical destruction of a believer. But the fact that we are citizens of a coming kingdom gives us the confidence to strive like athletes. All the while we thank and praise God for the work that he's doing. Like the Apostle Paul says in another place, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because it's God who works in you both to will and do of his good pleasure.